Tonight, we follow the footsteps of a god so clever, his laughter could change the course of history. A child born in secret, a thief before he could walk, and a trickster whose mischief charmed even the mightiest of Olympus. For centuries, Hermes has been remembered as the messenger, the one with winged sandals and words swifter than wind. But behind that image lies something far more intriguing, a life of gentle adventures where every prank carried wisdom and every trick revealed a truth. This isn't just about stolen cattle or hidden sandals. It's about music born from a tortoiseshell, the first riddles told to children, the whispers of dreams carried across a bridge of starlight. It's about a god who could outwit war itself, comfort the lost, and remind even Zeus that laughter was as powerful as thunder. From moonlit mischief to secrets guarded on the wind, Hermes' journey was never only about speed. It was about wonder, curiosity, and the magic of seeing the world as a game that never ends. So before you think of him as just another god in the background, ask yourself, what if the smallest jokes held the greatest truths? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we follow Hermes the Trickster, and his adventures are only just beginning. On the edge of night, when the stars still clung to the heavens and the first blush of dawn was yet to arrive, there was a cave hidden deep in the slopes of Mount Cylon. Few mortals knew of this place, and even fewer gods visited it, for it was a place wrapped in silence and shadow. Yet on one extraordinary morning, the silence was broken by the first cries of a newborn. His name was Hermes, and from the moment he entered the world, nothing would ever be the same. The cave glowed faintly, as though the mountain itself was welcoming him. His mother, Maia, the shy daughter of Atlas, cradled him close, whispering gentle words into his ear. She had chosen this hidden cave to keep him safe from the jealous eyes of Olympus, for she knew even before he opened his eyes that he was destined to be more than ordinary. There was something in the air that morning, a hum like music just waiting to be heard. The child was unlike any other. His eyes sparkled with a mischief that no infant should have known, and his tiny hands reached not only for his mother, but for the flickering shadows that danced on the walls. He giggled at the darkness, as though it were a toy made just for him. Outside the cave, the mountain winds stirred, carrying with them the faint scent of pine and the distant sound of flowing water. The world was stirring, and so too was the spirit of the child. Hermes was not a god who would wait quietly for life to come to him. Even as Maia tried to hush him, he wriggled free, kicking his feet and twisting in her arms, eager for something more. The cave itself seemed to bend to his will. Small stones rolled toward him as if pulled by unseen hands, and a curious tortoise wandered in, resting beside him, as though answering a silent call. Maia watched in awe, for she knew this was no ordinary child. He was a child of dawn, a bringer of light and laughter, and already a master of secrets. She rocked him gently, whispering ancient stories of his father Zeus. But Hermes listened with a spark of cunning in his gaze, as if plotting his own tales already. As the first rays of dawn touched the peak of Mount Cylon, golden light spilled into the cave. It caught the newborn's face, and for a moment, it seemed as though he wore a crown of sunlight. He laughed then, not the cry of a helpless babe, but the laugh of one who already understood the joke of the world. It was soft, but full of promise, a sound that made the very cave echo with delight. Maia pressed him close, whispering his name again and again. Hermes the clever, Hermes the swift, Hermes the trickster. On that morning the gods above stirred, sensing that something new had arrived in the world. Zeus lifted his gaze from Olympus. The fates pricked their ears, and even Apollo, far away, felt a ripple in the air, though he did not yet know that his own story was about to be tied forever with this child. But for now, Hermes lay in his mother's arms, eyes wide open, staring at the world with curiosity unbroken by fear. And in the hush before the sun fully rose, the mountain seemed to hold its breath, knowing that this child born of dawn would one day dance between shadows and light, guiding mortals and gods alike with wit, laughter, and endless wonder. The sun had barely risen over Mount Silene when Hermes began to show that he was no ordinary child. Though still swaddled in cloth and cradled in his mother's cave, his eyes sparkled with ideas that reached far beyond the quiet stone walls. While most infants would be content with the warmth of a mother's arms, Hermes reached for the world around him with a restless curiosity. Every sound and shadow became a puzzle to solve, every object a tool to twist into something new. It was as if his mind had been born racing ahead, eager to create, eager to play. Maia, his gentle mother, often tried to rock him to sleep, but Hermes rarely stayed still. Instead, he found joy in turning even the smallest things into games. A pebble rolling across the ground became a chariot in his imagination. A twig was transformed into a spear or a wand, depending on his mood. When the tortoise he had called to himself wandered into the cave once more, Hermes clapped with delight and tapped the creature's shell, humming a tune that echoed through the stone chamber. The tortoise stretched its head toward him as though enchanted, and Hermes laughed as though the two were sharing a secret no one else could understand. He pulled reeds from the edges of the cave, where the light trickled in, bending them and plucking at them until they made music, faint and thin but sweet. Maia listened, astonished, for what child so small could create melodies when most had not yet learned to speak? But Hermes was not like other children. His mind spun with invention, and his hands moved with surprising skill. With every new discovery he laughed, a soft bubbling sound that filled the cave with warmth and wonder. Soon he invented games to test his wit. He would stack small stones into towers and then knock them down, pretending it was a battle between giants. He would scatter bits of bark across the ground, only to rearrange them into shapes that looked like stars. When Maia told him stories of constellations, Hermes mimicked them with his bits of bark, smiling proudly as though he too could place stars in the sky. At times, his mischief was directed toward his mother. When Maia would set him down to fetch water, she often returned to find Hermes wriggling toward the mouth of the cave, eyes bright with a daring glimmer. He would coo as if to say, "Catch me if you can," before bursting into fits of laughter at her worried face. She could never truly scold him, for even in his tricks there was something endearing. Hermes was clever, yes, but his cleverness was softened by the joy it brought. Never cruel, always playful. And so the days passed, with the cave echoing not with silence, but with laughter, music, and the clatter of Hermes' small games. Even the winds seemed to pause at the cave's mouth, carrying his laughter down the slopes of Mount Silene. It was clear to Maia, and perhaps to the listening gods above, that this was no ordinary infant. This was a child whose games would one day shape the fate of gods and men, a child whose tricks were only just beginning. Night often came softly to the cave on Mount Silene, wrapping it in cool shadows and the quiet hum of crickets. Maia would sit with her child close to her heart, cradling him as the stars began their watch. Hermes, though still so young, never closed his eyes easily. His mind was restless, darting from one thought to another, and his tiny fingers would tug at his mother's hair or grasp at her necklace as if he could not bear stillness. To calm him, Maia began to sing, her voice gentle and low. weaving stories into lullabies. She told of Zeus, the mighty ruler of Olympus, whose thunder shaped the sky. She spoke of Hera, proud and watchful, and of Poseidon, who ruled the deep oceans with a restless hand. Her voice painted the great tales of the gods, filling the cave with the colors of legend. Hermes listened, wide-eyed, the rhythm of her words washing over him like waves. Most children would drift to sleep beneath such songs, but Hermes was not most children. Instead of closing his eyes, he opened his mind wider, storing every word, every name, every secret his mother let slip. His tiny face would crease into a smile, and though Maia thought her words were lulling him, Hermes was already spinning new plans in his clever little head. One night she sang of Apollo, the shining archer who drew his bow with the grace of the sun itself. Hermes clutched at his blanket, his eyes glowing with mischief. He did not know the god yet, but something in the story stirred him. He imagined himself standing in sunlight, not as a helpless infant, but as a quick-footed youth, challenging the radiant archer with riddles and games. He pictured Apollo's frown and his own laughter, already enjoying a victory that had not yet come. Maia noticed the sparkle in her son's eyes, and she sighed, brushing her hand against his cheek. "You must rest, little one," she whispered. "Not every story needs to be a plan." But Hermes only cooed back, as though promising that someday he would turn every story into his own adventure. She kissed his forehead and began another tale, this time of Hades, who ruled beneath the earth. Yet Hermes did not shiver at the thought of darkness and shadows. Instead, he seemed curious. What secrets lay in the underworld? What mysteries could be uncovered in a place where no mortal dared linger? Already he dreamed of paths others feared to tread. And so the lullabies continued, night after night. And though Maia's voice was filled with love and meant for comfort, Hermes treated each word like a clue to a hidden treasure. He learned the strengths of the gods, their tempers, their domains, and even their flaws. His mother believed she was singing him into sleep, but truly, she was feeding the fire of his imagination. Hermes' eyes would finally close, heavy with dreams, but even in slumber, his lips sometimes curved into a knowing smile. For deep in his heart, he was already planning adventures that would carry him beyond the cave, beyond the mountain, and into the world where his cleverness would meet the gods themselves. The night was quiet on Mount Selene, the kind of quiet where even the wind seemed to hush itself so the stars could listen. Inside the cave, Maia slept deeply, weary from days of soothing her restless child. But Hermes was wide awake. His tiny feet kicked against his blanket, his eyes glimmered with mischief, and his mind pulsed with curiosity. He had listened to enough lullabies, dreamed enough dreams, and now the world outside called to him with whispers too sweet to ignore. He waited until his mother's breathing settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. Then he wriggled free from her arms. The floor was cold beneath his bare feet, but Hermes did not mind. Every stone felt like a step toward something greater. He glanced once at Maia, his clever eyes softening for a moment, but then the thrill of adventure pulled him toward the mouth of the cave. The moon hung low above the mountains, casting silver paths across the rocks, as though the night itself had carved a trail just for him. His tiny feet padded forward, cautious but quick, and he laughed softly at the thrill of being unseen. The world outside was vast compared to his small frame. The trees rose like towers, their branches whispering secrets to one another, and the grass swayed like an ocean of shadows. Hermes stepped into the night as if he had always belonged there. Each sound fascinated him, from the chirp of a cricket to the rustle of a hidden fox, and each shadow seemed alive with possibility. He crouched to scoop up a smooth stone, rolling it in his palm as though it were a prize from some secret quest. He tucked it into the folds of his cloth, as if it might serve him later in a game only he could imagine. Hermes wandered further, following the moonlight as though it were a guide. He climbed over rocks, his small hands gripping tightly, and scrambled down slopes with surprising agility. For all his size, he moved with the daring of a traveler who had crossed the world. He paused now and then, tilting his head to listen, as though he expected to hear the voices of the gods themselves. Instead, he heard the gentle rush of a stream, and he followed it until he reached its edge. The water shimmered under the moon, cool and inviting. Hermes dipped his fingers into it and laughed, splashing as though greeting an old friend. Though he had no destination, his heart carried him forward. Every step was a promise to himself that he would not be confined to one cave or one mountain. The night was his playground, and the earth seemed to bend to his will. He imagined the paths beyond, the lands of mortals and the halls of gods, and even the hidden realms his mother's lullabies had spoken of. He did not fear the darkness, for to him it was not a threat but a canvas waiting to be painted with tricks and discoveries. When the first hints of dawn touched the sky, Hermes turned back, his feet tracing the silver path once more. He slipped into the cave before Maya stirred, curling himself into her arms as though he had never left. But his heart still raced with the thrill of adventure, and his smile betrayed the secret of his tiny feet. This was only the beginning. The morning sun stretched over the mountains and painted the land in gold. But Hermes was already awake, with a plan bubbling in his clever little mind. Though he was still only a child, his thoughts were sharper than most grown men, and his restless spirit searched for mischief worthy of his name. Stories of Apollo had reached his ears, tales of the radiant god who commanded the sun, played the lyre, and owned a herd of the finest cattle the world had ever seen. To anyone else, the idea of touching even one of Apollo's cows would have been madness. To Hermes, it was the perfect challenge. He crept from the cave while Maya slept, his tiny feet light against the earth. The air smelled of pine and fresh grass, and the distant sound of lowing cattle called to him like a song. His heart quickened with excitement as he followed the trail, weaving through rocks and streams until the great herd came into view. They grazed in the meadow, golden in the sunlight, their hides gleaming as if the sun itself blessed them. Hermes grinned, for the sight was more magnificent than he imagined, and he knew at once that he must have them, not out of hunger, but out of daring. Now Hermes was no fool. He understood that stealing from Apollo would bring wrath swift as lightning. So he bent his cleverness to the task, fashioning tricks as quickly as others might blink. He gathered branches and stripped them into makeshift sandals, tying them to the cattle's hooves so that their tracks would confuse anyone who followed. With each careful step he guided the cows away, urging them quietly with sounds only they seemed to understand. The herd moved slowly at first, but under Hermes' touch, they obeyed, as if enchanted. The trickiest part came when he turned them backwards, making it seem as though the cattle had wandered in the opposite direction. The ground bore signs of chaos, footprints going the wrong way, trails twisting like riddles. Anyone searching would be lost in the puzzle, and Hermes chuckled at his own brilliance. His tiny body tugged and pushed with surprising strength, his determination greater than his size. The cattle, as though sensing the humor of the act, followed him down the winding paths until he found a hidden grove where he could keep them safe from sight. When at last the herd was gathered in secret, Hermes stood proudly, his chest rising with triumph. The morning was still young, the sun barely reaching its height, And yet he had outwitted one of the greatest gods with nothing but wit and daring. He pressed his small hands together in glee and laughed, the sound echoing through the grove. To Hermes, it was not theft but a game, a test of his cleverness and boldness. Far away, Apollo would soon discover his cattle missing, and anger would stir in his heart like fire. But for now, Hermes rested among the stolen herd, his eyes gleaming with joy. The adventure had begun, and though trouble would surely follow, the trickster child had already proven that no challenge was too great for him. The grove where Hermes hid Apollo's cattle was quiet, but the clever child knew that quiet would not last forever. Apollo was not blind, and sooner or later he would come searching. Hermes' heart raced, not with fear, but with excitement. To him, each danger was simply another game to win. As he sat among the cattle, he studied the earth beneath him, the soft soil pressed by hooves and his own small feet. He realized at once that footprints were stories written in the ground, stories that could lead a hunter straight to him. If he wished to remain hidden, he would have to rewrite the story. Hermes looked around for materials, his sharp eyes catching sight of bark, reeds, and long leaves scattered near the grove. He tugged at them with determined little hands, weaving them together in patterns that only he could imagine. Piece by piece, he formed a strange covering, wide and flat, that he strapped to his feet with twine made from twisted grass. When he stood and took a step, the earth did not hold the mark of his toes or his heels. Instead, the print was wide, odd, and confusing. Hermes laughed aloud, clapping his hands at his success. With this invention, he could walk anywhere and leave behind no sign that pointed to him. To test his clever trick, he trotted around the grove in loops and circles. The ground now looked as though it had been visited by strange creatures, rather than a single mischievous child. Even the cattle seemed to sense the humor of it, their large eyes blinking as Hermes darted about, his tiny body brimming with joy. When he returned to the herd, he placed similar coverings on the hooves of several cows. It was not easy, for the animals shifted and huffed, but Hermes soothed them with a pat and a soft hum. One by one, the herd's tracks began to vanish into nonsense. Some prints pointed forward, others sideways, and some even looked as though the cattle had walked backward. The path became a puzzle, a riddle carved into earth and stone, and Hermes knew Apollo would find no straight answer there. He wiped his brow with his small hand and grinned. This was no ordinary trick. This was invention, the kind that set him apart from gods and mortals alike. Hermes understood now that cleverness was more powerful than strength, and that a good trick could topple even the greatest foe. He imagined Apollo's face when he tried to follow the tracks, the confusion, the frown, and finally the laughter, because even Apollo would have to admit it was brilliant. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Hermes slipped his sandals off and hid them carefully among the reeds, a secret tool for future games. He nestled against the cattle, his eyelids heavy but his heart still racing with triumph. He had stolen not only the herd but also the chase itself, twisting it into a riddle no god could solve. And though he was still only a child, Hermes knew he had taken his first step toward becoming a legend, one clever trick at a time. The sun burned high in the sky when Apollo discovered that his beloved cattle were gone. At first he thought they had wandered off, but the moment he saw the tangle of tracks stamped across the fields, his sharp eyes narrowed. These were not the marks of animals moving freely. Someone had taken them. Rage filled him like fire, for Apollo prized his herd as much as his music and his bow. He slung his shining quiver across his back and followed the trail, his steps quick, his face stern. The tracks twisted and turned, crossing over themselves in ways that seemed to mock him. Some pointed forward, others backward, and some were so strange they looked like no hoof Apollo had ever seen. He bent low to the ground, his golden hair falling across his face, and studied the prints. They made no sense, and that made his anger rise even higher. Someone was playing a trick on him. Apollo's voice thundered across the valley as he called out to the unseen thief, his words carrying like arrows on the wind. It did not take long for suspicion to find a name: Hermes. Apollo had heard whispers of the clever child born to Maya, the one already known for laughter and games. No infant should have been capable of such cunning, yet the thought nagged at him. Who else but the trickster boy could twist the world so easily? Apollo's fury grew, and he followed the trail into the hills, each step echoing with his determination to confront the thief. Meanwhile, Hermes sat in the grove where he had hidden the cattle. His small body rested against a rock, but his mind was busy with thoughts of how long his game could last. When he heard Apollo's voice booming across the land, he felt a thrill rather than fear. The game had reached its next stage, and Hermes was eager to see how it would unfold. He hurried back to the cave, slipping into Maia's arms and wrapping himself in blankets, as though he had been sleeping all along. When Apollo arrived at the cave, the air seemed to tremble with his anger. His golden eyes blazed as he strode inside, his bow gleaming on his back. Maia looked up in alarm, clutching Hermes tightly, but Apollo's gaze fixed on the child. "You have taken what is mine," he declared, his voice sharp as a blade. Hermes blinked up at him with the innocence of a babe, his small hands reaching toward the god as if in greeting. He cooed softly, his face all wonder and charm. Apollo's anger did not cool, but a flicker of doubt stirred in him. Could such a small child truly be the thief? Yet the glimmer in Hermes' eyes betrayed him, a spark of mischief too clever to hide. Apollo leaned closer, his voice low and fierce. "Return them, little one, or face my wrath." Hermes only giggled, the sound light and playful, as though the warning were nothing more than another story from his mother's lips. The cave filled with tension, the clash of fire and laughter, and in that moment, the tale of Hermes and Apollo truly began. Apollo's anger filled the cave like a storm, yet Hermes did not tremble. He only tilted his head, his clever eyes sparkling with mischief and calm. His small hands played with the edge of his blanket, but his mind was racing faster than the wind. He knew he could not match Apollo's strength or power. What he needed was a gift, something so wondrous that even the radiant god could not help but forgive him. As Apollo's voice rumbled, demanding his cattle, Hermes' gaze drifted to the tortoise shell lying near the cave's entrance. At once, an idea as brilliant as sunlight itself came to him. When Apollo stepped outside to pace, Hermes wriggled free from Maia's arms and hurried to the shell. He worked quickly, his fingers weaving reeds and strings stretched from the sinew of the stolen herd. The tortoiseshell curved perfectly, its hollow body ready to carry sound. Hermes plucked the first string, and a soft note filled the air, trembling like a whisper of dawn. He smiled wide, for he had just created something the world had never known. He had built the lyre. As Apollo returned, Hermes sat with the instrument across his lap. His small hands moved gracefully, as though they had always known how to summon music from silence. The strings sang under his touch, gentle at first and then brighter, filling the cave with melodies that shimmered like sunlight on water. The notes rose and fell, each one sweeter than the last, and even the mountains seemed to lean closer to listen. Maia's eyes widened, her heart swelling with pride, for she understood that this was no ordinary sound. This was a gift born of genius. Apollo froze at the entrance, his fury halting mid-step. The music wrapped around him, easing the fire in his chest. His eyes softened as the tune carried him away from anger and into wonder. He listened as Hermes played, the child's face glowing with joy, the sound weaving tales of dawn and dusk, of rivers running and stars twinkling. Apollo lowered his bow, his breath slowing. Never had he heard anything so pure, so filled with beauty. Hermes looked up with innocence, though the sparkle of cunning was never far from his gaze. He held out the lyre, its strings still trembling. "This is for you," he said softly, his voice as sweet as the song. Apollo reached for it, his strong hands wrapping around the delicate frame. When he plucked the strings himself, the music poured forth again, bright and full. And he laughed, the last of his anger dissolving like mist in sunlight. The gift had worked. The cattle no longer mattered, for Apollo had been given something greater, something eternal. He bent toward the child and spoke with a smile at last. "You are no thief, Hermes. You are a maker, a bringer of joy. With this gift you have turned wrath into laughter." And so it was that the first song of the lyre echoed across Mount Cylon, binding Hermes and Apollo together not as enemies, but as brothers in music. The world itself seemed to sigh with relief, and Hermes, clever as ever, rested in his mother's arms with a grin, knowing he had won peace with nothing but wit, strings, and song. News of Hermes' tricks and inventions spread quickly across Olympus, carried by whispers of gods and the laughter of nymphs who delighted in the tales. It was not long before Zeus himself heard of the child who had stolen Apollo's cattle, fooled the world with backward tracks, and then soothed his angry brother with music so sweet it melted even fire. Zeus sat upon his golden throne, thunder curling around his shoulders, and he smiled. For while many gods feared trickery, Zeus admired wit, especially when it was bold enough to outshine wrath. He decided the time had come to meet his son face to face. Summoning the winds, Zeus called for Maia to bring Hermes to Olympus. Maia trembled at the thought, for she knew how powerful and unpredictable the king of the gods could be. Yet Hermes was not afraid. His small feet bounced as they climbed the shining steps, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with curiosity. He gazed at the marble halls, the blazing fires, and the mighty throne as if he had already imagined them 100 times before. When at last they stood before Zeus, Maia bowed low, but Hermes looked straight into his father's eyes with a grin. Zeus studied him in silence, his gaze as heavy as storm clouds. "You," he said at last, "are the child who dares to steal from Apollo, who dares to twist the path of the world and then turn wrath into song. What am I to do with you?" The court of Olympus hushed, waiting to hear the judgment. Some expected punishment, others a warning. But Hermes stood proudly, his head tilted in mischief, and answered with a simple laugh. "I only wished to play," he said, his voice clear. "And in playing, I have brought music to Apollo and joy to all who hear." The boldness of the reply stirred the hall. Even Hera raised her brow, though she hid a smile behind her hand. Apollo himself stepped forward, holding the lyre, and bowed his head. "Father," he said, "this child has given me a gift greater than cattle. His tricks may anger, but his heart is bright, and his wit is unmatched. Let him not be punished, but guided." Zeus leaned back, thunder rumbling low in his chest like distant laughter. He saw in Hermes not only mischief, but promise, a spark of cleverness that could serve both gods and mortals. "Very well," he declared, his voice rolling like a storm across the heavens. From this day forward, Hermes shall be our messenger. He shall carry words swifter than wind, cross worlds seen and unseen, and guide both dreams and souls. Let him be known as the god of travelers, of trade, of secrets, and of tricks that bind rather than break. The hall erupted with voices, some in surprise, others in joy. Maia clutched her son close, her heart full, while Hermes laughed and twirled, already imagining the adventures to come. Zeus lifted his hand, and in a flash of light bestowed upon the boy the promise of winged sandals and a staff of power yet to come. And so the decision was made, the fate of Hermes sealed by thunder and wit. From that day on, he was no longer just a clever child of Maia, but Hermes, messenger of the gods, born to dance between the realms of heaven, earth, and beyond. The morning air on Olympus shimmered with expectation as the gods gathered to see the boy who had turned mischief into legend. Hermes stood in the center of the great hall, small but unshaken, his eyes glinting with eagerness. Zeus rose from his throne, his voice rolling like thunder, yet softened with pride. Today, he said, you will no longer be just the clever child of Maia. Today you take your place among the gods, with gifts that will mark your new role forever. At his words, the halls of Olympus stirred with light. From the hands of Hephaestus came the first gift, a pair of sandals forged with leather and bound with golden wings. They gleamed as though touched by sunlight, delicate yet strong, each feather carved with care to catch the air itself. Hermes reached for them, his fingers trembling with delight. The moment he slipped them on, the sandals lifted him lightly from the ground. His tiny body floated, his feet no longer bound to stone or soil. He laughed, spinning in the air, darting from one side of the hall to the other faster than the eye could follow. Even the sternest gods could not hide their smiles at the sight of his joy. Then came the second gift, carried by Zeus himself, a staff of polished wood, simple at first glance, but alive with hidden power. Around it, two golden serpents twined together, their heads lifted in harmony, their bodies shining with wisdom. This was the caduceus, a staff that would mark Hermes as a guide between realms, a keeper of peace, a bearer of secrets. Zeus placed it in his son's hands, and Hermes felt the weight of destiny. Not heavy, but thrilling, as though every adventure he had imagined was waiting to burst forth. The serpents glowed softly, their eyes bright, as if welcoming him. With sandals on his feet and staff in his hand, Hermes soared higher into the air. He zipped above the gods, his laughter ringing like music. He swept through pillars, skimmed the clouds drifting across the mountain, and returned in a flash to hover before Zeus. "Father," he said with a playful bow, "I will carry your words swifter than the wind, and I will guard your secrets as if they were my own." The gods cheered, their voices echoing across Olympus. Apollo strummed the lyre Hermes had given him, filling the air with music, while Artemis, goddess of the hunt, nodded in respect. Hera, though watchful, admitted with a rare smile that Hermes might prove useful. Even Hades, far below in his shadowed kingdom, felt the stir of a new presence, destined to one day walk his realm without fear. Hermes landed softly, the wings at his heels folding as though resting. He twirled the staff once in his hands and pressed it to the ground, the serpents gleaming in approval. In that moment, he was no longer just a clever child, no longer just a trickster. He was the messenger, the traveler, the bridge between gods and mortals. And though mischief would forever dance in his eyes, his new role shone brighter than the dawn itself. The first days with his winged sandals were filled with laughter and daring. Hermes would race the winds, darting between clouds, testing how high he could climb before the sky thinned into stars. Yet being messenger of the gods was not a game alone. Zeus called him to the throne and spoke with thunder in his voice. To serve Olympus, you must learn the paths no mortal knows, the roads that weave between earth, sea, and sky. They are not written on stone or map, but only in memory, and they must be mastered if you are to carry our words. Hermes listened eagerly, his staff resting in his hands, his sandals twitching as if they longed to leap into flight. Apollo was sent as his guide, though he carried no anger now, only the calm pride of an older brother. Together they rose into the air, Apollo's light blazing like dawn, Hermes darting at his side like a spark of fire. They soared across the curve of the earth, Apollo pointing to valleys, mountains, and seas. Here is the road of the sky, he said, where winds gather and lightning sleeps. Here is the path above the oceans, where the gulls cry and the waves below echo your wings. Hermes took in every word, though he often rushed ahead, eager to test the routes for himself. He dove toward the sea, skimming the foam with his toes, then shot upward through the clouds until his laughter trailed like silver. Apollo shook his head, but even he could not help smiling. The boy had not only speed but instinct. He seemed to know where the air was softest, where currents lifted him higher, where silence itself carved hidden tunnels through the heavens. From sky to sea they traveled, and then Apollo led him downward into the caverns of the earth. The light dimmed, the air grew still, yet Hermes' sandals carried him sure and steady. This is the road of shadows, Apollo said, the way to the underworld. Few may walk it, but you will guide those who must. Hermes nodded, his clever eyes wide, not with fear, but with wonder. Even the dark seemed to him like another game, another mystery waiting to be solved. Day after day they practiced, and soon Hermes could weave between realms without pause. He could carry messages across the mountains before a mortal had blinked, across the sea before a sailor had set his sail, across the underworld before silence could swallow his steps. He was faster than hawks, surer than waves, lighter than mist. When he returned to Olympus, his chest rose with pride. The gods watched him land, his wings folding neatly, his staff glowing with quiet power. Zeus looked upon him and knew his choice had been right. Hermes, still a trickster at heart, had now become more than clever. He was a messenger in training no longer, but a traveler of every road, ready to serve wherever the gods might send him. And in his smile shone the promise that no message, no matter how secret or distant, would ever be lost again. Zeus sat upon his throne, the skies rumbling softly around him, while Hermes stood at the foot of the hall, sandals gleaming, staff in hand, eager for what was to come. The gods watched with quiet curiosity, for though Hermes had proven his speed and wit, he had not yet been sent beyond Olympus on true service. Zeus leaned forward, his eyes flashing like stormlight. "Today you will run your first errand," he declared, "not to show your swiftness alone, but to prove that cleverness and care guide your steps as much as laughter." Hermes' heart raced. What task would his father give him? A journey across the seas, a message to the underworld, or perhaps a secret only whispered by the winds? Zeus smiled, knowing his son's restless mind, and spoke. "You are to deliver this message to Hera, but you must not let the other gods hear a word of it. And you must do so before the sun sets behind the mountains." The message was sealed in a golden scroll, small enough for Hermes' hand, yet heavy with importance. At once Hermes leapt into the air, sandals beating against the sky. But he soon realized the task was not as simple as it seemed. The halls of Olympus were alive with chatter and curiosity. Gods and goddesses lingered in the corridors, their eyes sharp and their ears sharper still. Athena looked at him knowingly, asking where he was flying in such haste. Poseidon appeared near a fountain, his trident gleaming, and demanded to know what business was so urgent. Even Apollo strummed his lyre and called out playfully, hoping to trick his young brother into revealing the secret. Hermes grinned at each of them, never slowing his pace. To Athena, he replied, with a riddle that led her thinking of stars instead of scrolls. To Poseidon, he pointed at the waves below, teasing him into racing the foam to the shore. To Apollo, he sang a verse so full of laughter that the archer forgot his question and joined in the tune. With every trick, Hermes turned eyes away from the golden scroll pressed close against his chest. But time was slipping. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in red and orange. Hermes darted through clouds, swooped past columns of marble, and at last reached Hera's chambers. She looked up from her throne, regal and watchful, and raised her hand to take the scroll. Hermes bowed low, placing it in her palm before the final ray of sun dipped below the horizon. Hera's eyes softened with rare approval as she unsealed the message, and though she said nothing of its words, a faint smile touched her lips. When Hermes returned to Zeus, the great god's laughter rolled like thunder. "You have done well, my son," he said. "Not only swift but wise, not only bold but careful. The other gods may chase you with questions, but you will always find a way." From that day forth, Hermes knew that errands would never be simple, for every task carried a trick, a test, or a hidden turn. And he welcomed it, for there was nothing he loved more than a game that proved his wit. One quiet afternoon, Hermes wandered away from the shining halls of Olympus, his sandals carrying him gently down to the slopes of Mount Selene, where wildflowers danced in the breeze, and streams whispered their songs to the stones. Though he had traveled far and wide, there was still something comforting about the mountain where he had first opened his eyes to the world. As he walked, he noticed a small tortoise moving slowly across the grass, its shell gleaming in the sunlight like a polished shield. The creature's steady pace caught Hermes' attention, for he himself was never still, always darting like a spark from one thought to another. He crouched low, staff resting against his shoulder, and smiled at the tortoise. "Where are you going, little wanderer?" he asked softly. The tortoise only blinked its dark eyes and kept moving, step by step, unhurried and calm. Hermes laughed, amused by the contrast. "I am fast as wind, and you are slow as earth, yet we both walk the same paths." The tortoise looked up at him, as though understanding, but no words came. That silence did not please Hermes. He loved conversation, riddles, songs, and laughter. To meet a creature with such a curious shell and such quiet eyes yet no voice to share seemed a waste to him. He tapped his caduceus staff lightly on the ground and thought of the power it carried. Then he remembered the way he had strung reeds into music, how he had made the first lyre sing from a tortoise shell. His clever mind sparked with a new idea. Why should this creature remain voiceless when a gift of speech could turn its silence into stories? With a grin, he bent low and whispered a charm, weaving words into the air like threads of gold. The serpents on his staff glowed faintly, their eyes bright, and a gentle shimmer wrapped around the tortoise. At first there was nothing. Then the tortoise blinked again, lifted its head, and to Hermes' delight, spoke. "Hello," it said, in a voice smooth and calm like the flow of a river. Hermes clapped his hands in joy. "Now that is better. Tell me, friend, what is it like to walk so slowly while the world races ahead? The tortoise answered with wisdom far older than Hermes expected. When you walk slowly, you see more. The flowers are brighter, the air tastes sweeter, and the earth beneath your feet is never rushed. Hermes sat beside his new friend, laughing and asking question after question. The tortoise replied with patience, sometimes teasing, sometimes wise, and together they passed the afternoon in endless talk. For Hermes, who loved speed and mischief, it was a lesson he would never forget, that even the slowest step can lead to the grandest view. As the sun dipped behind the mountain, Hermes lifted the tortoise into his arms and promised, "You will never walk in silence again." From that day on, the talking tortoise became his companion, a steady voice to balance the laughter of the trickster god, and their friendship was remembered in stories told for generations. The grand halls of Olympus shimmered with light as the gods gathered for a feast. Long tables stretched beneath pillars of marble, piled high with golden platters of roasted meats, baskets overflowing with ripe fruits, and cups that sparkled with nectar. The air was thick with music and laughter, and the scent of honey cakes drifted like a dream. While the gods spoke of battles, prophecies, and glories, Hermes sat quietly at the edge of the banquet, his clever eyes darting across the endless food. To most, it was simply a celebration, but to Hermes it looked like an opportunity waiting to be played with. He thought of the nymphs in the forests, the dryads and satyrs, who lived far below the shining peaks. They had no endless tables of food, no golden cups, only berries plucked from bushes and water drawn from streams. Hermes tilted his head, his mind sparking with a plan. Why should the banquet belong to Olympus alone, when laughter and feasting were sweeter when shared? A smile curved across his lips, and without a sound, he slipped away from his seat. Moving as light as wind, Hermes darted between the gods. His sandals skimmed the floor without a sound, his staff glimmered faintly, and his hands moved quick as thought. He plucked grapes from platters, tucked loaves of bread into folds of cloth, and filled a small jug with golden nectar. Each time a god turned to laugh or raise a toast, Hermes vanished from sight, hiding behind pillars or ducking beneath the tables. No one noticed the food disappearing, for the tables were so full that even the smallest theft went unseen. When his bundle was full, Hermes slipped through the shining doors of the hall and soared down the mountain. The night air welcomed him, cool and crisp, carrying the songs of crickets and the rustle of leaves. He landed in a moonlit clearing, where the forest spirits often gathered. The nymphs looked up in surprise, their eyes wide as Hermes appeared with his arms full of food. Satyrs paused their pipes, and dryads stepped from their trees, drawn by the scent of roasted meat and honey. Hermes spread the feast across the grass, laughing as the spirits gasped in wonder. At first they hesitated, for no god had ever brought them such gifts. But Hermes clapped his hands and urged them to eat. Soon the clearing rang with joy. Satyrs played their flutes, nymphs danced in circles, and the air was alive with music and laughter. Nectar spilled into cups of carved wood, bread was torn and passed around, and the honey cakes melted sweetly on their tongues. Hermes joined in the dance, spinning through the grass with quick steps, his laughter mingling with theirs. Far above, the gods feasted still, unaware that their banquet had been shared with the forest below. Hermes knew the risk he had taken, but as he watched the spirits celebrate, he felt no regret. For what was the joy of food if not shared? The clearing glowed with laughter, and Hermes, the trickster with a generous heart, knew he had created a hidden feast that would be remembered long after the tables of Olympus were cleared. There was once a giant who lived near the edges of the mountains, so tall that his head brushed the treetops and his footsteps made the ground shiver. His name was Brontes, and though he was not cruel, he was restless and loud. He spent his days stomping across valleys, shaking rocks loose from cliffs, and roaring songs that frightened the herds below. The mortals who lived nearby could never find peace, for his voice thundered through the night, and his heavy steps crushed their fields. The gods debated what to do, but it was Hermes who stepped forward with a smile. "Let me try," he said, "for even giants must listen to words." With his winged sandals glimmering, Hermes flew to the place where Brontes sat on a boulder, humming a tune so deep the trees rattled. The giant's eyes were heavy, but he refused to rest, as if the earth itself begged him to stay awake and rumble forever. Hermes landed lightly on the giant's knee, no more than a spark compared to the great bulk of his body. Brontes peered down, frowning in confusion. "Who are you, little flea, buzzing at my knee?" Hermes only laughed, tipping his head. "I am Hermes, messenger of the gods, and I have come not to scold you, but to share a story." Brontes snorted, but his curiosity held him still. Hermes leaned close, his voice soft and flowing, weaving words like a lullaby. He spoke of rivers that sang to the sea, of clouds that curled into pillows of silver, of winds that rocked the mountains as gently as a mother rocks her child. Each word was a thread, and together they spun a blanket of calm around the giant's restless mind. As Brontes listened, his eyelids began to droop, his breath slowing like the tide. Then Hermes drew forth his lyre, the same instrument he had once crafted to charm Apollo. He plucked the strings lightly, and the notes drifted into the night like falling petals. The song was not bright or playful, but smooth and deep, echoing the rhythm of the earth itself. The giant's great head lowered, his voice softened into a hum that matched the melody, and his body sank against the hillside. Hermes played on, his fingers steady, his eyes warm with patience. Brontes sighed, the sound rolling across the valley like distant thunder. His eyes finally closed, and for the first time in many years, the mountain was still. His snores were gentle, like waves against the shore, and the mortals below slept in peace at last. Hermes rested his lyre against his shoulder and chuckled softly. "Even the mightiest fall to the simplest trick," he said, and he spread his wings to return to Olympus. The gods praised him when he arrived, for he had calmed a giant, not with chains or war, but with clever words and music. From that day forward, Brontes was known not as the roaring giant, but as the sleepy one, lulled by Hermes' gift of song. And so the valleys remained quiet, guarded by the laughter of a trickster who knew that sometimes the best way to win was to bring rest instead of battle. Among the gods of Olympus there was none more fierce than Ares, the god of war. His armor gleamed red as fire, and his temper was quick to rise like a storm. He loved nothing more than the clash of swords and the cry of battle, and he carried a great blade that shone like lightning. Wherever Ares went, mortals trembled, and even gods stepped aside. But Hermes, quick of wit and light of heart, was not one to bow before rage. To him, even war was something to be played with, and one day he decided that Ares' pride would be the perfect target for a trick. It began when Ares stormed through Olympus, declaring that he would march to the mortal fields and prove once more his strength. He boasted of his sword, holding it high so that the steel caught the sun. "No enemy can stand before this blade," he roared, and the gods listened in silence. Hermes, sitting at the edge of the hall with a mischievous smile, leaned on his staff and thought to himself, what if the mighty sword of Ares were to vanish? What would the god of war be without his weapon? That night, while the fires of Olympus burned low and Ares rested after boasting his fill, Hermes crept into the chamber where the sword lay. The blade shimmered faintly in the darkness, humming with power. But Hermes was not afraid. His sandals carried him silently across the floor, and with a swift hand he lifted the sword, wrapping it in a cloak to hide its glow. With a laugh barely louder than a whisper, he carried it away, choosing the unlikeliest of hiding places. Deep within the garden of the gods, Hermes wedged the sword beneath a thick cluster of grapevines, their heavy fruit dangling low, masking the steel with the sweet scent of wine. The next morning, Olympus shook with the fury of Ares. His roar echoed from the halls as he searched for his missing weapon. "Who dares steal the sword of war?" he thundered, his eyes blazing. He turned the marble floors upside down, calling upon Zeus, Athena, even Apollo to reveal the thief. Yet no one spoke, for none had seen Hermes slip away with his prize. When Hermes appeared, floating lightly on his winged sandals, he greeted Ares with innocent laughter. "Why do you rage so loudly, brother?" he teased. "Have you lost something important?" Ares glared, his fists clenching. "Do not mock me, child," he growled. "Without my sword I cannot march, and without battle I cannot live." Hermes tilted his head, pretending to think. "Perhaps war is not in the blade but in the spirit that wields it," he said, his voice playful. "But if you insist, perhaps you should look where grapes grow thick and shadows hide their treasures." At once Ares stormed to the garden, tearing through the vines until at last he uncovered his blade. His fury cooled as he lifted it high, but the laughter of Hermes still rang in his ears. Though anger burned, even Ares could not deny the cleverness of the trick. He shook his head and muttered, "You are too bold for your own good." Hermes only grinned, his eyes bright with triumph, for he had shown that even the god of war could be disarmed, not by strength, but by wit and a well-placed joke. The day was warm and bright when Hermes felt the call of the sea. His sandals carried him swiftly down from the peaks of Olympus to the shore where the waves rolled in shining blue and white. The salty air filled his lungs, and the laughter of gulls echoed above him. To Hermes, the sea was not a boundary but another path to explore, another place where tricks and games could be played. As he stood at the edge of the water, the waves parted with a sudden splash, and a pod of dolphins leapt into the air, their sleek bodies glimmering like silver under the sun. Hermes clapped his hands in delight. "Greetings, friends," he called, and the dolphins circled close, chattering in whistles and clicks. Though mortals could not understand such sounds, Hermes, with his gift of language and wit, heard their voices as clear as words. They teased him playfully, asking who he was to stand on the shore with wings at his feet and laughter in his eyes. "I am Hermes," he answered, "messenger of the gods, and swifter than any creature of sea or sky." The dolphins flicked their tails and squeaked in challenge. "Then prove it, little winged one. Race us across the waves." Hermes' grin widened. A race was just the sort of game he loved. With a leap, he soared into the air, sandals glimmering as they carried him low over the water. The dolphins surged forward, sleek and fast, their fins cutting through the sea like blades. At first they were ahead, darting and diving, their speed unmatched in their own domain. But Hermes was no ordinary challenger. He swooped and skimmed across the waves, his toes brushing the foam, his laughter ringing out as he pushed his wings faster. The race stretched on, the sea sparkling with their playful battle. At times the dolphins leapt so high that their bodies arched beside Hermes, close enough that he could reach out and touch their slick skin. At other times Hermes darted ahead, teasing them with a wave of his staff before spinning away. The air was alive with joy, the waves clapping like hands in rhythm with their game. As they neared the horizon, the dolphins dove deep, vanishing beneath the surface. For a moment, Hermes thought he had won, but then they burst forth all at once, springing into the air in a dazzling display, landing ahead with a splash so loud it echoed like thunder. Hermes laughed so hard he nearly lost his balance, then poured every ounce of speed into his sandals, wings beating against the sea breeze. The race ended in a tie, both Hermes and the dolphins arriving together at the far shore, breathless with excitement. The dolphins sang their victory, not in boasting but in joy, and Hermes bowed to them with a grin. "You are as fast as the sea itself," he said, "and worthy of every tale that will be told of you." From that day forward, the dolphins remembered Hermes not only as a god, but as a friend who had shared their game. And whenever they leapt from the waves beneath the golden sun, it was said they still raced the wind, chasing the laughter of the trickster god who once skimmed the sea at their side. In the green valleys, where rivers wound their silver paths through meadows, there lived nymphs who tended the waters with grace and laughter. They sang as they bathed in the streams, their voices drifting like music through the reeds, and mortals who heard them swore the sound was sweeter than any harp. Hermes, with his restless spirit and quick feet, often passed by these valleys on his journeys. One day, when the sun was high and the air shimmered with warmth, he paused at the bank of a wide river and watched the nymphs at play. Their laughter rose like bells, and he felt the familiar spark of mischief stir in his chest. He crouched low among the reeds, his sandals glimmering in the sunlight, and thought of a trick to brighten the day. From his pouch he drew smooth pebbles, polished by the mountain streams, and with a flick of his fingers, he sent them skipping across the water. The nymphs turned in surprise, wondering what spirit played at the river's edge. They saw no one, only ripples where the stones danced, and their eyes widened with curiosity. Again Hermes skipped a pebble, this time so high it leapt like a fish before vanishing into the current. The nymphs gasped, then laughed, clapping their hands. At last Hermes stepped from the reeds, his grin bright as dawn. "Greetings, fair sisters of the river," he called. "It is I, Hermes, and I challenge you to a game." The nymphs, delighted by the sparkle in his eyes, gathered at the water's edge. "What game, trickster?" they asked, their voices lilting like streams over stone. Hermes raised his staff and tapped the ground. "Whoever can make the river laugh the loudest shall win." The nymphs giggled at such a strange challenge, but they agreed. One by one they sang songs into the water, their voices rippling across the current. The river shimmered and bubbled, answering with gentle splashes. Then Hermes stepped forward, crouched at the bank, and whispered riddles into the stream. The water gurgled in reply, tumbling over rocks as though chuckling at his words. The nymphs clapped their hands to their mouths, for they had never heard the river laugh before. Hermes did not stop there. He darted to and fro, tossing blossoms into the stream so that the petals swirled like dancers. He tickled the water with his staff, sending sprays that sparkled in the sun. Soon the nymphs joined him, splashing and spinning, their hair streaming behind them like silver. Their laughter echoed through the valley, mixing with the chuckle of the river, until even the trees seemed to sway in joy. By the time the sun dipped low, the game had no winner, for all agreed the river itself had claimed the prize. Hermes bowed to the nymphs, his grin wide. "You have taught me that laughter shared is laughter doubled," he said. They waved as he rose into the air, their eyes shining with delight. And from that day, whenever the river rippled with sudden mirth, the people believed it was the echo of Hermes' tricks. and the laughter of the nymphs who had played with him beneath the golden sun. The night was dark and heavy with silence as a lone traveler stumbled along a narrow path through the hills. His cloak was torn, his sandals worn thin, and his eyes were weary from searching for a road that never seemed to appear. He had lost his way at sunset, and now the moon hid behind clouds, leaving him with nothing but shadows. Each step felt colder, and the rustling of leaves filled him with unease. He whispered a prayer to the gods for guidance, though he doubted any would hear. Far above, Hermes glided through the sky, his winged sandals glowing faintly against the darkness. He heard the man's soft plea, and curiosity pulled him downward. To Hermes, a lost soul was not a burden, but a chance for kindness, a chance to turn fear into comfort. He landed lightly on the path ahead, his staff in hand, his cloak shimmering as though woven from the night itself. The traveler froze, his heart racing, unsure if he faced a god or a ghost. Hermes smiled warmly, the kind of smile that eased worry before a word was spoken. "You walk with heavy steps, friend," he said gently. "Tell me, where do you seek to go?" The traveler bowed his head, his voice trembling. "I seek my village beyond these hills, but I have wandered too far. I fear the night will claim me before I find the way." Hermes tapped his staff against the earth, and the path seemed to brighten, lit by a glow like starlight spilled across the ground. "Fear not," he said, "for no road is truly lost if you walk it with courage. Come, I will guide you." The traveler's eyes filled with wonder, and he followed as Hermes walked ahead, his steps light as though the air itself carried him. As they moved, Hermes spoke softly, weaving stories into the night. He told of stars that guided sailors across the seas, of rivers that found their way to the ocean no matter how far they strayed, of wanderers who discovered home where they least expected. The traveler listened, his heart easing with each tale, and soon his fear gave way to hope. The darkness no longer felt empty, for Hermes' words filled it with light. At one point the traveler stumbled, but Hermes reached out, steadying him with a gentle hand. "Strength is not in never falling," he said, "but in rising again with laughter." The man smiled for the first time that night, warmed by the god's kindness. Soon the path opened onto a meadow, and in the distance the glow of a village flickered like fireflies. The traveler gasped, tears of relief shining in his eyes. Hermes lifted his staff, and the starlight upon the path faded. "Here is your way," he said, his voice soft. "Walk on and remember, no traveler is ever truly alone." With that, Hermes leapt into the sky, vanishing among the clouds. The traveler fell to his knees in gratitude, his heart lighter than it had been in many days. And though he would tell no one of the mysterious guide, he carried the memory forever, a reminder that even in the darkest night, a gentle trickster god might walk beside the lonely. There is a place hidden between the waking world and the land of sleep, where a bridge stretches across a river of mist. Few mortals ever see it, for it only appears when dreams are strongest, and those who walk it must be guided lest they fall into endless slumber. This bridge is woven from moonlight and shadow, delicate yet strong, and it glows faintly with colors that shift like the northern lights. Hermes, with his winged sandals and staff, was chosen to guard it, for no one else could dance so lightly between realms. One night, as the stars glittered above, Hermes stood upon the bridge, his sandals barely touching its shining surface. Below him, the river rolled silently, carrying forgotten dreams away like fallen leaves. Across the bridge, he saw dreamers arriving, their eyes closed, though their feet moved as if carried by wind. They came from every corner of the world, men and women, children and elders, their bodies asleep, yet their spirits wandering. Some walked bravely, others trembled, unsure of where the path would lead. Hermes greeted them with a smile, his voice gentle as he lifted his staff. "Welcome, dreamers," he said. "Fear not, for this bridge will bear you safely if you trust its light. Follow me, and you shall pass from night into dawn without harm." His words wrapped around them like a lullaby, and their steps grew steadier. The youngest dreamers clutched invisible toys, while the older ones carried burdens that weighed on their shoulders. Yet all looked to Hermes for comfort. As they crossed, the bridge shifted, showing visions of their hearts. One saw fields of wheat that promised a harvest. Another saw a loved one waiting by a warm hearth, and still another saw the sea opening into golden paths. Hermes touched each with his staff, ensuring the visions guided rather than misled. At times the mist below rose higher, curling like grasping hands. But Hermes only laughed softly and twirled his staff, sending ripples of starlight to push the darkness back. Near the middle of the bridge, a boy hesitated, staring down at the swirling river. "I fear I will fall," he whispered. Hermes knelt beside him, his eyes kind. "Look not at what waits below," he said, "but at the stars above." The boy lifted his gaze, and the bridge steadied beneath him, glowing brighter as he stepped forward. Soon the others followed, their fears fading as Hermes led them onward. At last they reached the far side, where the dawn shimmered like a curtain of gold. Hermes raised his staff, and the dreamers passed through, returning to their sleeping bodies with hearts lightened and minds at peace. The bridge faded behind them, melting into mist, until only silence remained. Hermes lingered a moment longer, gazing across the empty span, and smiled. For he knew that as long as dreams touched mortal hearts, his duty would never end. Night after night he would guide them, the trickster turned guardian, ensuring that every wanderer of sleep found their way safely home to the light of morning. The river was wide and restless, its waters rushing with a force that frightened those who lived along its banks. Mortals gathered at its edge, staring across at the fertile fields on the other side, fields that promised food and shelter. Yet the current was too strong to swim, and the stones too slippery to step across. For many seasons they had dreamed of crossing, but none dared to try, fearing the river would swallow them whole. It was on such a day that Hermes appeared, his sandals glimmering with soft light, his staff in hand, his eyes filled with the sparkle of mischief and kindness. He landed lightly among them and listened to their worries. "Why do you wait here so long?" he asked. The mortals bowed low, explaining their fear. "The river is too strong and we cannot pass." Hermes tilted his head, smiling. "You look at the water and see danger. I look at the trees and see bridges waiting to be built." The people glanced at one another, uncertain of what he meant. Hermes walked to the edge of the forest, placed his hand upon a fallen branch, and tapped it with his staff. The wood seemed to hum beneath his touch. "See," he said, "this is not just a tree, but the beginning of a raft." The mortals watched as he gathered logs, lashing them together with vines. His hands moved quickly, clever and sure, until the logs formed a wide, flat shape. He pushed it into the water, and to their surprise, it floated, bobbing gently upon the current. Hermes laughed at their astonishment. "The river cannot be fought," he explained, "but it can be ridden. Like a song, you must follow its rhythm, and it will carry you instead of taking you under." He invited them aboard, and though they trembled, they stepped onto the raft. With a push of his staff, Hermes guided it into the stream. At first, the mortals clung to one another, but Hermes lifted his arms and let the current take them. The raft swayed and dipped, but it held strong. Soon the people opened their eyes and saw the river not as an enemy but as a road, wide and gleaming, stretching beneath the sky. Their fear melted into wonder. When they reached the far shore, Hermes showed them how to shape smaller rafts, how to carve wood into curved hulls, how to tie reeds together into boats that could skim across the water like fish. Day by day the mortals learned, their hands growing skilled, their hearts growing bold. Where once the river had trapped them, now it became their path to trade, to travel, to explore. As the people celebrated, Hermes soared above them, his laughter ringing through the valley. He knew they would remember this gift not as a trick, but as a blessing. From that day forward, whenever mortals built boats or rafts to carry them safely across the waters, they whispered a prayer of thanks to Hermes, the clever messenger who turned fear into freedom with nothing more than wood, vines, and the spark of an idea. In a small village nestled between rolling hills and a wide river, the people lived simply, each family keeping what they could grow or craft. One family had goats and milk, another had fields of grain, while yet another carved tools from stone. But often they quarreled, for one needed bread while another had only wool, and still another desired honey while their neighbor could only offer clay pots. The people grew restless, unsure of how to share without anger. It was on such a day that Hermes appeared, his sandals glimmering as he stepped into the busy square, his staff in hand, and his eyes bright with mischief. He listened to their arguments, the loud voices clashing like thunder, and then he laughed softly. "Why do you quarrel?" he asked, "when you each have something the other needs?" The people fell silent, puzzled by his words. Hermes crouched beside a basket of apples, plucking one up and holding it high. "You desire grain," he said to the shepherd, "and you have wool that the farmer might need. Trade what you have for what you seek, and both will be richer." The shepherd frowned. "But how shall we know what is fair?" Hermes' grin widened. "That is the game," he said, "the trick of balance. If wool keeps you warm, how many loaves of bread will match its worth? If honey sweetens your lips, how many apples will you offer for a jar?" The people murmured among themselves, curious but uncertain. To show them, Hermes staged a test. He took a clay pot from one man and handed it to a woman with a jar of milk. She looked confused, but Hermes nodded. "Now, if you wish for honey, find the one who holds it, and offer the milk in return." The game unfolded like magic. The milk passed to the beekeeper, who traded for grain, which in turn went to the shepherd, who gave wool to the farmer, and so the circle spun. By the end, each person held something new, something needed, and laughter spread where once there had been quarrels. Hermes raised his staff, pleased. "You see," he said, "wealth is not in hoarding but in sharing. The trick of trade is that everyone wins if each gives fairly." The people cheered, their eyes shining with excitement. They began to gather in the square each morning, bringing what they had and trading for what they lacked. Soon the place became a market alive with chatter, laughter, and the clink of goods exchanged. Hermes, watching from above, chuckled at the lively scene. He had planted a seed of cleverness that would grow across the world. Mortals would learn not only to barter, but to create coins and tokens, ways of measuring worth, and markets would rise in every land. Yet he knew it all began with a trick, a playful idea that turned quarrels into games and neighbors into partners. And so the people remembered Hermes as the patron of trade, the swift-footed god who taught them that the greatest treasures are not kept in silence, but shared in the bustling dance of the market. The day was fading into twilight, when Hermes first felt the gentle tug of a soul leaving the mortal world. He had been soaring above the hills, watching smoke curl from village hearths when a hush fell over the land. It was the silence of parting, the breath between life and death. Hermes paused in the air, his sandals beating softly against the dimming sky, and listened. The whisper came again, faint but clear, calling him toward a small cottage at the edge of the forest. Inside, an old man lay upon a bed of woven straw. His family gathered close. Their faces were heavy with sorrow, but the old man's eyes held peace. His final breath slipped into the room like a sigh, and in that moment his spirit rose, shimmering faintly in the firelight. The soul looked around, confused and uncertain, as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. He saw his loved ones but could no longer touch them, and his gaze filled with longing. Hermes stepped forward, unseen by the family but bright to the soul. "Do not be afraid," he said softly. "Your journey is not ended, only changed." The spirit turned, startled, but Hermes' kind smile eased the fear. "Who are you?" asked the soul, his voice trembling like wind through reeds. "I am Hermes, guide of travelers, messenger of the gods, and tonight I walk with you." With a gesture of his staff, Hermes opened a path through the shadows. The walls of the cottage melted away, replaced by a road of silver dust, winding into the night. The air grew cooler, the world quieter, as they walked side by side. The soul glanced back once, seeing his family still grieving, and Hermes touched his shoulder. "They will remember you," he said, "but now you must move forward." The old man nodded slowly, comforted by the warmth in Hermes' voice. The path grew darker as they descended, the stars above fading into mist. Strange shapes stirred at the edges of the road, shadows whispering, but none dared cross while Hermes' staff glowed. The soul walked close, his steps uncertain, yet Hermes' presence steadied him. To distract him from fear, Hermes told gentle stories of the night sky, of constellations shining like lanterns, of rivers that carried dreams. The soul listened, his worry softening into calm. At last they reached the banks of the great river that marked the edge of the underworld. The waters flowed black and endless, yet their surface gleamed faintly in the dim light. Hermes paused at the shore, raising his staff. "Here I leave you," he said gently. "Beyond this river, another will guide you." The soul hesitated, but Hermes met his eyes with kindness. "You are not lost, only moving onward. Go in peace." The soul bowed his head, gratitude shining in his fading form, and stepped into the mist where another presence waited. Hermes watched until the figure was gone, then turned back, his sandals lifting him once more toward the world above. For the first time, he understood the weight of his duty, not only to carry messages of gods, but to carry hearts safely through shadows. And though he was a trickster, he vowed that every soul who walked beside him would find comfort in the journey. In a quiet village, at the edge of a wide meadow, children gathered each evening around a small fire, while their parents worked or rested nearby. They played simple games with stones and sticks, but their laughter often faded when the night grew long and shadows crept across the grass. One evening, Hermes appeared among them, stepping lightly with his winged sandals, his staff glowing faintly like a lantern. The children gasped with wonder, for they knew at once that this was no ordinary visitor. Hermes crouched beside them with a grin. "Shall I show you a new kind of game?" he asked. "One that lives not in stones or sticks, but in your voices and minds?" The children nodded eagerly, their eyes bright. Hermes tapped his staff upon the ground and began to weave words into shapes. He spoke a riddle first, a question wrapped in mystery. "I am not alive, yet I grow. I have no mouth, yet I roar. I feed on air, yet I die in water. What am I? The children whispered to one another, puzzled, until one small boy shouted, "Fire!" Hermes clapped his hands in delight. "Well guessed, young one. That is the trick of riddles. They hide truth in playful words, and only the cleverest can unwrap them." Soon the children begged for more, and Hermes taught them how to make their own riddles. One girl asked, "What runs but has no legs?" Another laughed and answered, "A river." The game spread quickly, each child eager to outwit the others with questions that twisted words into puzzles. Their laughter rose into the night, echoing across the meadow like music. But Hermes did not stop with riddles. He leaned close and told them that stories too were gifts of words, powerful and endless. A story, he explained, is a path you build with your voice. Each listener walks it, seeing what you describe, feeling what you imagine. He began a tale of a fox who tricked a lion by pretending to be small and harmless, only to escape with his life when the lion least expected it. The children listened wide-eyed, gasping and laughing at every turn. When he finished, he urged them to try. At first they stumbled, unsure how to shape a beginning or an end. But Hermes encouraged them, reminding them that a story need not be grand to be magical. One child told of a sparrow who sang so sweetly that even the wind paused to listen. Another spoke of a pebble that dreamed of becoming a star. Hermes laughed with joy, for their stories sparkled with wonder, simple yet full of heart. As the fire burned low, Hermes rose, his staff glowing softly. "Remember," he told them, "words are treasures greater than gold. With riddles you sharpen your minds, with stories you brighten the hearts of others. Carry these gifts wherever you go, and you will never be poor." The children waved as he lifted into the night, their voices already buzzing with new riddles and tales. And long after he vanished into the stars, the meadow rang with the gift of words, passed from a clever trickster god to the youngest voices of the earth. There are paths in the sky that no mortal can see, trails woven by the breath of the world itself. The winds carry not only the scent of flowers and the chill of storms, but also the whispers of secrets too delicate for voices to shout. Hermes, with his winged sandals and his caduceus staff, was the only one nimble enough to ride those hidden currents. When Zeus wished to send a message that no ear but the chosen should hear, he summoned Hermes and pointed to the skies. "Carry this," he would say, "not on paper, not in stone, but on the breath of wind itself." Hermes would leap into the air, sandals flashing, and listen closely. The winds were never silent. Some rustled with the laughter of children, others with the sighs of lovers, and still others with the cries of sailors lost at sea. Yet beneath it all, Hermes could hear the secret strands, like threads of silver twisting through the sky. He leaned into them, letting the gusts lift him higher, until he moved as swiftly as thought, his ears sharp to catch the faintest murmur. One night, he was sent with a message for a queen who feared betrayal in her court. The words were too precious to write, too dangerous to carry, so Zeus whispered them into the wind. Hermes caught the sound as though cradling a fragile flame and carried it across valleys and oceans. The journey was long, yet the secret never left him, for the winds guarded it as carefully as he did. When at last he reached the queen's chamber, he bent low and let the wind sigh the message into her dreams. She woke with understanding, her heart steady, saved by a truth carried on air. Another time, Hermes delivered words of comfort to a lonely shepherd who believed the gods had forgotten him. He swooped low across the meadow, where the shepherd watched his flock beneath the stars. The wind curled around Hermes' lips, and he whispered softly, "You are not alone." The shepherd looked up, eyes wide, for the breeze itself seemed to speak. He smiled, warmed by the thought that even in the silence of night, the gods still listened. Hermes delighted in this work, for it was both trick and kindness. He laughed as he darted through storms, twisting lightning aside, or skimmed across calm skies where his sandals stirred only the gentlest breeze. To him, each journey was a game, a dance between the seen and unseen. Yet he also knew the weight of the task, for secrets were powerful, and a word spoken at the right moment could change the course of fate. When he returned to Olympus after each errand, Zeus would ask, "Did the words arrive?" And Hermes would smile, bowing low, and answer, "Swifter than thought, lighter than shadow, your message rests where it was meant to be." The winds would stir in agreement, carrying his laughter across the skies. From then on, mortals who felt a sudden whisper in the breeze often wondered if it was Hermes himself, gliding past, delivering yet another secret on the wings of the whispering wind. The night sky was clear, and the moon shone full and bright, casting silver light across the mountains and seas. Mortals looked up with wonder, lovers whispered beneath its glow, and travelers followed its path to guide their steps. But Hermes, ever restless, watched from Olympus with a grin tugging at his lips. To him, the moon was not only a light but also a perfect toy, and he wondered what might happen if it were to vanish for just a little while. Mischief sparked in his heart, and before long he was soaring upward on his winged sandals, his staff gleaming in his hand. He darted higher and higher until he reached the glowing orb itself. The moon hummed softly, as if alive, and Hermes laughed as he circled around it. "Forgive me, bright sister," he whispered playfully, "but I must borrow you for a trick." With a twist of his staff, he wrapped the moon in a veil of shadows, pulling it from mortal sight. At once, the world below gasped in darkness. Lovers cried out, sailors searched the heavens in fear, and even owls paused in their flights. The stars still glittered, but without the moon the sky felt hollow, as though a great secret had been stolen away. Hermes chuckled as he swooped over the earth, listening to the confusion he had caused. Villagers lit extra torches, mothers hushed their children with worried voices, and storytellers spun sudden tales of monsters swallowing the night. The trickster god grinned, pleased at the ripple of surprise. Yet as he watched, he also saw fear growing among the mortals, and even the gods began to frown. Artemis, who loved the moon as her companion, demanded to know who had hidden it. Apollo's golden eyes blazed with suspicion, and Hera crossed her arms in displeasure. Hermes realized his jest had gone far enough. With a playful sigh, he rose once more to the heavens. "Very well," he said, laughing softly. "A trick is sweetest when it does not wound." He lifted his staff and pulled the veil away, setting the moon free. At once its silver light poured over the world again, bathing the fields and seas in calm. Mortals sighed in relief, sailors cheered, and the owls resumed their flights. Lovers smiled once more, whispering under the glow as though nothing had been lost. When Hermes returned to Olympus, the gods scolded him. Though their eyes betrayed a hint of amusement, Artemis shook her head, though even she hid a smile. "You should not play with the moon," she said firmly. Hermes bowed low, grinning. "I only wish to remind mortals not to take her light for granted." That night, as the world settled under the moon's calm glow, Hermes perched on a cloud and laughed to himself. The trick had been bold, perhaps too bold. Yet it proved that even the brightest light could be hidden by a clever hand. And though the gods warned him not to try such mischief again, Hermes knew that somewhere in the future, another night would surely tempt him to play with the sky once more. Deep beneath the earth where sunlight never reached, the underworld stretched vast and silent. Shadows drifted across black rivers, and the air was heavy with the weight of countless souls. It was here that Hades, stern and unyielding, ruled as Lord of the Dead. Few gods dared to enter his realm, for his presence was as still and certain as stone. Yet Hermes, with his winged sandals and his caduceus staff, had been chosen to walk those hidden paths. Unlike others, he did not fear the dark, for his role as guide meant he must know every road, even those that led into shadow. One day, Zeus sent Hermes with a request. A mortal king, favored by Olympus, had died too soon by accident, and the gods wished to grant him a few more years of life. It was not a command to take lightly, for the balance between life and death was delicate, and Hades guarded it with care. Hermes descended through caverns where no bird sang and no wind stirred, his staff glowing faintly as he walked. The souls parted before him, recognizing the gentle messenger who carried them safely to their rest. At last he came to the throne of Hades, where the Lord sat in silence, a crown of black iron upon his brow. Hermes bowed deeply, his tone respectful. "Great Hades, ruler of the unseen, I come with words from Olympus. A mortal beloved of the gods has been taken too soon. Zeus asks that he be returned to life for a span of years more." Hades regarded him with dark eyes, heavy as night. "You know well, Hermes, that the dead belong to me once they cross the threshold. To return one is to break the order. Why should I grant this favor?" Hermes met his gaze calmly, his voice steady though soft. "Because even the order of death serves the greater balance, and mercy too has its place. The king whose soul rests here was struck before his time, not by fate, but by chance. If he is restored, he will honor you with offerings for the rest of his life, and his people will build temples that speak your name with reverence rather than fear." The silence stretched, heavy and deep. Hades drummed his fingers on the arm of his throne, the sound echoing like distant thunder. At last he said, "You are a trickster, Hermes, but you speak with honesty now. I will grant this one return, not for Zeus alone, but because you have asked with respect. Remember, though, such bargains are rare, and the dead are not toys to be passed back and forth." Hermes bowed again, gratitude shining in his eyes. "I understand, Lord of Shadows, and I will carry your words to Olympus." With a wave of his staff, he guided the mortal king's soul back toward the world above, where life awaited. When Hermes emerged into the light of day, the people rejoiced to see their king breathe again. Yet Hermes carried with him more than victory. He carried respect for Hades, who ruled with fairness, and a reminder that even the god of mischief must bow when he walked the path through shadows. The gods of Olympus had gathered for a great wedding feast, a celebration filled with music, laughter, and tables heavy with food and wine. Yet not every god had been invited. Eris, goddess of strife, had been left out, for wherever she went, quarrels followed. Angered by the insult, she devised a plan to disturb the harmony of the banquet. With a sly smile, she shaped a golden apple, bright as sunlight, and upon it she carved the words, "To the fairest." Then, waiting until the hall was filled with joy, she rolled the apple across the floor. It gleamed as it spun, and every eye turned to follow it. The apple came to rest at Hermes' feet. He bent down, lifting it carefully, the golden glow warming his hands. The words shone clearly, and Hermes raised his brow in amusement. He already sensed the trouble it would cause, for every goddess in the hall had beauty, and each believed herself the fairest. He looked toward Zeus, who sat on his throne with thunder in his eyes, and offered the apple to him. But Zeus shook his head. "I will not choose among them," he said, "for no matter who is named, strife will follow. Instead, you, Hermes, must deliver this apple to one who can judge with wisdom." The hall grew tense as Hera, queen of the gods, stood tall, her pride shimmering like her crown. Beside her, Athena, goddess of wisdom, narrowed her eyes, certain that no other deserved the title. Aphrodite, radiant with love and charm, smiled sweetly, already confident in her power. All three stepped forward, their voices rising in argument, each demanding the apple. The feast fell silent, for no one dared to take sides in their quarrel. All eyes turned to Hermes, who stood holding the golden fruit, his expression calm, though laughter danced in his heart. With a respectful bow, Hermes lifted the apple high. "My task is not to name the fairest," he said, "but to carry this gift to one who can decide." He glanced at Zeus, who nodded in agreement. Then Hermes spread his winged sandals and soared into the air, the apple gleaming in his grasp. Behind him, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite followed, their voices sharp as they demanded he give it to them. But Hermes was swift, darting through clouds, weaving between mountains, until he reached the green fields of the mortal world. There he found Paris, a shepherd prince tending his flock on the slopes of Mount Ida. Zeus had chosen him for his judgment, and Hermes landed before him with a smile. "Son of Troy," he said, "I bring you a gift of the gods. This apple is for the fairest, and you must decide who shall claim it." Paris looked startled, but before he could answer, the three goddesses appeared, each offering him promises of power, wisdom, or love. Hermes stepped back, watching as the choice unfolded. He knew that whatever Paris decided, strife would ripple across the world. Yet his role was only to carry the apple, not to shape the fate that followed. And so he smiled softly, for he had played his part in beginning a tale that mortals would tell for ages, a tale of pride, beauty, and war, all born from a single golden apple. The sun was sinking low, casting long golden shadows across the fields where children played. Their laughter rose like music, chasing away the quiet of evening. Among them was a small boy who wandered farther than the others, drawn toward the edge of a steep cliff where wildflowers grew in bright clusters. He reached for one of the blossoms, leaning too far, and the earth crumbled beneath his feet. With a startled cry, he slipped, tumbling downward, his tiny hands grasping for anything to hold. The world seemed to fall with him, and his voice echoed against the rocks. Far above, Hermes was gliding on the winds, his sandals flashing as he carried a message across the valley. His sharp ears caught the cry, thin and desperate, and his eyes darted toward the cliff. In an instant he turned, diving with the speed of lightning, his staff glowing in his hand. The boy was falling fast, the ground rushing up to meet him, but Hermes was faster still. He swept beneath the child, catching him gently in his arms, the wings at his heels beating strong to steady their flight. The boy clung to Hermes, his eyes wide with terror, but the god only smiled, his voice calm and soothing. "Fear not, little one. You are safe now." With a twist of his sandals, he lifted them higher, carrying the boy above the fields, the flowers, and the trembling cliff. The wind curled around them like a soft blanket, and the boy's sobs faded into wonder. Never before had he flown, and now the world spread beneath him, vast and beautiful, painted in the colors of sunset. Hermes slowed their flight, circling gently until they landed in a meadow where the boy's friends had gathered, their faces pale with fear. When they saw him return, their cries turned to cheers, and they rushed to embrace him. The boy looked up at Hermes with shining eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of awe. Hermes knelt, brushing the child's hair from his face. "Remember," he said kindly, "the earth is strong but also fragile. Walk with care, yet never lose your courage." The children begged Hermes to stay, to fly them through the skies on his winged sandals, but he only laughed. "Not today," he said with a twinkle in his eyes, "for I have errands yet to run." Still, he lifted from the ground once more, soaring upwards so swiftly that the children gasped, their eyes following him until he vanished into the clouds. That night the boy told his family of the god with wings on his feet, who had plucked him from the air like a feather. His words spread through the village, and soon all whispered prayers of thanks to Hermes, protector of travelers and guardian of the lost. And though Hermes was far away by then, speeding toward his next task, he carried with him the warmth of that rescue, knowing that sometimes even the smallest act of kindness could leave a mark as lasting as the stars in the sky. The night sky stretched endless and deep, a velvet canvas scattered with diamonds of light. Mortals gazed upward and told stories of hunters, lions, and queens among the stars, but Hermes, swift-footed and curious, wondered what secrets lay hidden beyond those shining points. One evening, as he glided silently on his winged sandals, he heard something faint in the air, a sound so soft it was almost mistaken for the wind. He paused, hovering above the clouds, and listened more closely. The stars were singing. It was not a song with words, but a rhythm, gentle and endless, like a heartbeat older than the world itself. Each constellation had its own note: Orion with a strong, steady hum, Lyra with a bright, clear tone, and the Pleiades with voices so delicate they shimmered like silver bells. Together their sounds wove into a melody that filled the heavens, hidden from all but the sharpest ears. Hermes felt the music wrap around him, tugging at his heart, and he knew he must learn it. He settled on the peak of a high mountain. The world hushed below him, and raised his staff as though it were a conductor's rod. Closing his eyes, he let the music guide his breath. Slowly, carefully, he tapped the rhythm on the ground, matching the pulse of the stars. His sandals twitched with the beat, wings fluttering in time, until his whole body swayed like a dancer to the hidden symphony. For hours he practiced, repeating each pattern until he could tell the constellations apart by their sound alone. At times he faltered, for the music was vast and layered. But Hermes never lost his grin. Each mistake was a puzzle, each pause a trick waiting to be solved. He plucked at his lyre, blending its strings with the cosmic notes, and to his delight the stars seemed to answer, glowing brighter when his melody matched theirs. The night sky sparkled as though applauding his effort, and Hermes laughed, his voice ringing across the heavens. The more he listened, the more he understood. The stars were not silent watchers, but guardians who kept the rhythm of the universe. Their music guided the turning of seasons, the ebb of tides, and even the dreams of mortals sleeping below. By learning their song, Hermes tapped into the very heartbeat of creation. He danced across the mountaintop, sandals flashing, his lyre echoing with the tune of eternity. When dawn touched the horizon, the music faded, softening into silence as the stars dimmed. Hermes bowed his head in respect, grateful for the gift they had shared. He knew he would return, night after night, to practice until the rhythms were his own. From then on, whenever he carried messages across the sky, he flew not only with speed, but with harmony, his wings beating in time with the constellations. Mortals who saw shooting stars streak across the heavens sometimes whispered that it was Hermes himself, dancing to the music of the stars, keeping the universe in rhythm with laughter and song. Hermes had always been curious about the edges of things, where light met shadow and sky touched earth. He believed that between such places there were secrets waiting to be found. And one evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, he followed a whisper of wind into a quiet grove. The trees stood tall and close, their branches weaving a roof above, and in the center lay a stone arch half buried in moss. It looked like nothing more than a ruin, yet Hermes felt the air tremble around it, as though it hid something greater. He stepped closer, his sandals brushing the soft grass, and tapped the arch with his caduceus staff. At once the moss stirred, glowing faintly, and a shimmer spread across the opening like ripples across water. Hermes laughed softly, for he had uncovered a doorway, not built by mortal hands, but shaped by the fabric of the worlds themselves. Without hesitation, he stepped through. On the other side, he found himself not in the grove, but in a vast meadow under a sky unlike any he had known. The stars were brighter, their music louder, and the air smelled of both sea and fire. Hermes twirled with delight, realizing he had crossed into a hidden realm, a place that touched both Earth and Olympus, but belonged fully to neither. He darted across the grass, his sandals carrying him swiftly, testing how far this secret world stretched. The paths twisted strangely, bending back upon themselves. A hill he climbed once led him again to the starting meadow, and a river he crossed returned him to its bank as if no time had passed. Hermes grinned, for such tricks pleased him. These were roads not meant for mortals, but for gods and spirits who needed shortcuts through creation. He tested each trail, marking them with strokes of his staff, until he began to map the hidden network. At times, he found himself stepping into mortal villages, arriving unseen in the heart of a market or behind the doors of a temple. At other times, he stumbled into Olympus itself, emerging behind golden pillars with laughter on his lips. Once he even opened a door into the edge of the underworld, though he quickly closed it again out of respect for Hades' realm. Each passage was a thread weaving the worlds together, and Hermes knew he was the only one nimble enough to walk them all. When he returned to the grove, the stone arch stood quiet once more, its glow fading into moss and shadow. Hermes tapped it gently and whispered, "I will return, for secrets are best kept when they are also explored." Then he soared into the sky, his heart racing with excitement. He had discovered not just one doorway, but many, hidden across the earth, sea, and sky. From that day forward, mortals who wondered how Hermes traveled so swiftly from one place to another guessed at winged sandals alone. But Hermes knew the truth. He carried in his mind a map of secret doorways, the hidden paths between worlds, and with every step he laughed at the joy of being the only one who could walk them all. The village square was alive with noise as merchants shouted, children ran between stalls, and the bells of a temple rang in the distance. In the middle of it all, a young man hurried, with a bundle of scrolls clutched to his chest. His master had sent him to deliver them before the sun reached its peak, yet his path was blocked at every turn. Carts toppled with fruit spilling onto the cobblestones. Goats broke free from their ropes, and a crowd pressed so tightly that he could not move. Panic filled his chest, for if he failed, his master would cast him out. He whispered a desperate plea to the gods for help, never expecting an answer. From above, Hermes heard his cry. The trickster god often smiled at mortal troubles, yet this one stirred his heart. It was not mischief the boy needed, but a chance, a sliver of time to breathe. With a flash of his winged sandals, Hermes descended into the square, invisible to mortal eyes. He twirled his caduceus staff once, twice, and then struck it gently against the ground. At once the world grew still. The fruit hung in the air where it had been tumbling, a pomegranate frozen mid-bounce. The goats stood stiff, their legs caught mid-step. The shouts of merchants faded into silence, mouths open but voices gone. Even the temple bells hung in the air, their echoes paused like a breath held too long. Only the boy moved, blinking in astonishment as he looked around at the motionless world. His heart raced faster, thinking at first that he had stepped into a dream. Hermes appeared at his side with a mischievous grin. "Do not be afraid," he said softly. "Time has only paused, a trick I play when it serves." The boy stammered, unsure whether to bow or run, but Hermes laid a calming hand on his shoulder. "You have but a moment, child. Use it well. The scrolls you carry matter, and I will see that you deliver them." Together they walked through the frozen square. Hermes guided him around the still figures, showing him how easily the path opened when time was no longer rushing against him. The boy's steps grew steadier, his fear fading into wonder. He asked, "Will the world remain still forever?" Hermes laughed lightly. "No, only as long as it must. Time is a river, and though I may touch it, I dare not dam it." At last they reached the temple steps, where the scrolls were to be delivered. The boy placed them carefully at the door, relief flooding his face. Hermes lifted his staff once more, tapping it against the stone. The bells resumed their ringing, the goats leapt forward, the fruit tumbled to the ground, and the square filled again with sound and motion. No one but the boy knew that a pause had happened at all. As Hermes prepared to leave, the boy whispered his thanks, but Hermes only smiled. "Remember," he said, "sometimes all you need is a single moment, and the world itself will change." With that, he vanished into the sky, leaving the boy with the memory of a god's trick of time, a gift as fleeting as it was priceless. The halls of Olympus were grand and shining, but they were not always filled with joy. At times the gods grew solemn, weighed down by disputes, duties, and the endless affairs of mortals. Zeus sat upon his throne with thunder clouds gathered around his brow. Hera's face was stern as she counted every slight, and Athena studied in silence, her thoughts sharp as blades. Even Apollo's music could not always break the stillness, for his songs were often lofty, meant to inspire rather than to stir laughter. It was on such a day that Hermes entered, his sandals fluttering, his eyes alight with mischief. He looked at the heavy faces of the gods and thought to himself, "What is Olympus without laughter?" He stepped to the center of the hall and bowed dramatically, as though he were a performer on a stage. "My lords and ladies," he said with exaggerated grandeur, "have you ever heard the story of the goat who wished to be king?" At once the gods turned their eyes to him, some frowning, others curious. Zeus rumbled, "We have no time for goats." But Hermes only grinned and began his tale. He spoke of a goat who stole a crown and tried to rule a flock of sheep, but could not resist eating the crown's wreath of leaves. With clever twists and silly voices, he acted out the tale, prancing like the goat, bleating so loudly that even Apollo smothered a laugh. The gods tried to keep their stern composure, but soon chuckles began to ripple across the hall. Even Hera, who rarely smiled at mischief, hid a grin behind her hand. Encouraged, Hermes spun into riddles, playful questions that twisted words until even wise Athena cracked a smile. He mimicked Poseidon's booming voice, only to turn it into the squeak of a fish, and the sea god's laughter shook the pillars themselves. He twirled Zeus's thunderbolt like a toy, juggling it with sparks flashing around him, then bowed with a flourish, as if he had tamed the storm. For a heartbeat Zeus glared, but then a roar of laughter burst from him, shaking the heavens more than any thunder could. Once the laughter began, it spread like fire. Dionysus rolled with mirth, Apollo's lyre strummed quick, playful notes, and even Hades, far below, felt a chuckle stir in his usually silent halls. The weight of solemnity lifted, replaced by the joy of shared amusement. The halls of Olympus rang not with arguments or silence, but with bright, unrestrained laughter, as though the very stones were glad to hear it. Hermes stood at the center, his eyes sparkling, his grin wide. "You see," he said, "wisdom and power may hold Olympus together, but laughter is what keeps it alive." The gods applauded, some still wiping tears of joy from their eyes, and Zeus declared, "Let there always be a place for your jokes, Hermes, for they bring light even when the sky is dark." And so, the messenger god became more than a trickster or a guide. He became the laughter of Olympus, the one who could turn stern faces bright and remind even the most serious deities that joy was a power as great as thunder or wisdom. From that day on, whenever gloom threatened the throne room, Hermes was called, and with a grin and a joke, he lifted Olympus into laughter once more. Hermes had long been known for his quick feet and quicker wit, but as the years passed, another gift of his began to shine. He listened, while others spoke loudly, boasting of victories or demanding their share of glory. Hermes leaned close to the softest voices, the whispers carried by mortals and gods alike. It began with small things: a shepherd confessing to the wind that he loved a girl across the valley, a sailor whispering a prayer before setting out to sea, a goddess murmuring her doubts into the night. Each word drifted on the air, and Hermes, who rode the wind as easily as a bird, gathered them all. At first, mortals believed the breeze itself was keeping their secrets, but in truth, Hermes cradled those words, tucking them safely into the folds of his heart. He did not use them for mischief, as some might expect, nor did he scatter them to stir quarrels. Instead, he kept them with care, guarding them as treasures. For he understood that secrets were not just words, but pieces of souls, fragile and precious. The gods soon noticed. One evening, Apollo confided in Hermes of a sorrow he could not share with his radiant songs. Another time, Athena admitted to him the weight of her endless wisdom, for even knowledge can feel like a burden when held too long. Hermes listened without judgment, answering with a grin, a clever word, or sometimes only silence, and in that silence, the gods found comfort. They began to trust him, not only as a messenger, but as a keeper of what they dared not say aloud. Even Hades, lord of the underworld, spoke to Hermes in quiet moments, telling him of the loneliness of ruling a kingdom where joy seldom reached. Hermes never betrayed these words, though his playful heart often longed to share them. He knew that trust was its own kind of power, greater even than speed or song. The more he listened, the more beings came to him. Nymphs whispered their secrets to him by the riverside. Dryads told him their worries hidden in tree bark, and mortals murmured their hopes when they felt the brush of wind on their faces, never knowing he was near. One night, Zeus himself called Hermes to his throne and said, "You are my messenger, swift and clever, but more than that, you are the ear of Olympus. The world trusts you with its whispers, and I trust you to guard them. From this day you shall be known as the keeper of secrets." Hermes bowed, his grin softened into something solemn, for even he knew the weight of such an honor. And so he carried not only scrolls and words of command, but also the hidden truths of gods and mortals alike. He never boasted of them, never revealed them, but held them close as if they were delicate flames. From that day, whenever the wind rustled softly through the trees or brushed against a traveler's cheek, many believed it was Hermes passing by, listening, smiling, and tucking their secrets away into the endless vault of his heart. The sky was painted with streaks of gold and violet as Hermes stood on the highest peak of Olympus, his sandals stirring the air restlessly. Around him the gods sat in their halls, content with their thrones and domains. But Hermes' heart was never content with stillness. He was born with laughter in his eyes and wanderlust in his soul, and though he carried the titles of messenger, guide, and keeper of secrets, he felt most alive when his feet left the ground. With a grin he twirled his staff and whispered to the wind, "Where shall we go today?" The answer was everywhere. The sea sparkled in the distance, calling him to race the gulls and skim across the foam. The forests whispered with hidden paths he had yet to tread. The deserts stretched vast and endless, their dunes shifting like riddles written in sand. Even the stars above seemed to beckon, their soft music promising adventures far beyond mortal sight. Hermes laughed, for he knew he would not choose just one. He would wander them all. He launched himself into the air, soaring higher than eagles, faster than hawks, his sandals flashing with every beat. Villagers below looked up, pointing at the streak of light that darted across the sky, and whispered prayers of thanks, hoping the god might bless their travels. Hermes darted between clouds, dipped to touch the surface of rivers, and sped across plains until the horizon bent before him. Every place he visited, he left with a trace of joy. Whether it was a whispered secret to a lonely traveler, a riddle shared with a child, or a trick played on those who had grown too serious. Yet he did not wander only for mischief. In his journeys, he carried the voices of the gods, their commands and comforts, their warnings and blessings. To mortals, he was the swift answer to prayer, appearing when roads grew dark or journeys too long. To gods, he was the bridge, the one who moved between their distant realms with ease. To himself, he was something greater still, the eternal wanderer, never chained to throne or temple, but free as the air. At times, Hermes would pause on a cliff at dawn, watching the sun climb from the edge of the sea, and smile at the thought that while the other gods waited in their halls for worship, he would always be among the people, moving with them, laughing with them, guiding them. His sandals never gathered dust, for he never stayed long enough in one place. His staff never dulled, for it was polished by the countless paths he tapped upon. His heart never tired, for curiosity was an endless flame. And so Hermes roamed across mountains and valleys, through mortal villages and golden palaces, into the dreams of sleepers and the shadows of the underworld. Wherever there was a road, he walked it. Wherever there was a secret, he carried it. Wherever there was laughter, he joined it. For Hermes was not only the messenger of the gods, he was the eternal wanderer, a spirit of restless joy, forever chasing the horizon and finding wonder in every step. The sun was setting in soft shades of rose and gold, its light spilling gently across the mountains, forests, and seas. On the highest cloud of Olympus, Hermes sat with his sandals folded beneath him, his staff resting across his knees. He gazed down at the world, a smile playing at his lips as though he knew 1,000 secrets at once. For he had traveled far, from the laughter of children to the silence of the underworld, from the whispers of winds to the music of stars. Every path had carried him into wonder, and yet he knew his journey was only beginning. As the gods went about their endless duties, Hermes leaned back and let the breeze carry him upward. He had outwitted Apollo, tricked Ares, lulled giants to sleep, and guided mortals across rivers, roads, and even into their dreams. Yet through it all, he had never been cruel. His tricks were sparks meant to lighten heavy hearts. His mischief, a reminder that joy could live even in shadows. To mortals, he was a guide and a friend. To the gods, he was laughter and swift service. To himself, he was simply Hermes, a wanderer with wings on his feet and stories waiting at every turn. He looked once more at the earth below. Villages glowed with firelight. Fishermen rowed across dark rivers, and travelers lifted their eyes to the sky. Some of them whispered prayers, hoping for safe passage, while others told children bedtime tales of the clever god who always found a way. Hermes chuckled softly, pleased that his name carried warmth rather than fear. For though he was a trickster, he was also gentle, never leaving sorrow where he could plant laughter instead. The stars began to rise, their rhythm faintly singing, and Hermes tapped his staff in time with their music. He thought of the secrets entrusted to him, the dreams he had guided, the mortals he had rescued, and he felt a calm pride settle in his chest. Mischief might be his gift, but kindness was his choice. He knew he would continue to wonder, to play, to surprise, but also to comfort and guide. That was his promise to the world. As night wrapped itself around Olympus, Hermes spread his sandals and lifted into the air. The wind curled around him like an old friend, carrying his laughter across the sky. He darted through the constellations, weaving between stars, his eyes bright with endless curiosity. Wherever he went, he left behind a trace of joy, as fleeting as a breeze, but as memorable as dawn. And so the story closes, not with silence, but with Hermes' smile, playful and kind, promising more adventures to come, for he is never still, never finished, never far away. Somewhere on the wind, in the whisper of trees or the ripple of rivers, the gentle trickster still travels, carrying secrets, telling riddles, and reminding both gods and mortals alike that laughter is a light no darkness can ever dim.